it's a bit like blind dating. You can't be afraid of rejection. I think they like the psychological benefits of being an early investor. It's a time where the Japanese were walking away from US real estate, and it created an opportunity to create an interest in Rockefeller Center for really pennies on the dollar. The first activist investment in Pershing Square was Wendy's, and it owned a company called Tim Hortons. So I had a friend who worked at Blackstone, and I said, would Blackstone do a fairness opinion, in effect, what Wendy's would be worth if they spun off Tim Hortons?
Today, we're breaking down the origin story of Bill Ackman, from launching a fund straight out of Harvard to taking a shot at the Rockefeller Center and ultimately spinning off Tim Hortons with the help of a private equity behemoth. Now, for those who don't know, Bill Ackman is a multi-billionaire hedge fund founder of the firm Pershing Square Capital, where he makes activist investments, which basically means he buys big stakes in companies, and then he encourages the management to make changes to the business that benefit his investments. With that intro, I'm Boardroom Wire. I do strategic breakdowns of business and technology. Let's jump into Ackman's early career and how he got his start out of Harvard.
Pretty quickly, I figured out I wanted to be the investor as opposed to the arranger.
You wanted to be independent, so you wanted to go out on your own. How in the world does a kid raise money? How much did you raise and how did you do it?
So I had a partner, a classmate from business school, and it's a bit like blind dating. You can't be afraid of rejection. But you ask enough, and we had a good story to tell. At least I thought of it that way. And we went to people who had we basically went through the Forbes 400 list, and I cold called, and I got meetings, and the Forbes 400 is comprised of a lot of entrepreneurs who like the idea of a couple of young guys starting something, and they want to be part of it, and that's how we raised the money. And we asked them for, $500,000, and I think they like the psychological benefits of being an early investor.
So back in 1992, a then 26-year-old Bill Ackman had the idea to co-found a hedge fund with his business school classmate, David Berkowitz, directly out of school. So instead of sending their resumes to companies, they sat there and decided to start a hedge fund. Now, starting a hedge fund is really difficult for anyone, but when you're straight out of school, you have absolutely no track record and little to no connections, it's almost impossible. Now, being two graduates from Harvard, that definitely makes the process a little bit easier, but you got to give them credit where credit's due. A lot of people don't have the guts to call their own family members, let alone cold call billionaires in the Forbes 400. So they were very clearly ambitious young guys. And the firm that they ultimately founded, Gotham, wasn't just a cookie cutter fund. It actually had a contrarian playbook, investing in undervalued, complicated, and overlooked assets. So this is actually gonna be important later on when you see how Ackman's career really takes shape. But let's dive into the first deal that really put Bill Ackman on the map as a serious investor when he was at Gotham Partners. Let's roll it.
The Rockefeller.
Yeah, so
Tell us about
most significant
that and how you got a valuation from a firm.
Okay, so
That was Tim Horton, but first Rockefeller.
Okay, so Rockefeller Center was there was a public company that owned a $1.3 billion mortgage on Rockefeller Center. It was a time where the Japanese were walking away from US real estate. The mortgage was going to go into default, and it created an opportunity to create an interest in Rockefeller Center for really pennies on the dollar. And we bought a stake, and again, I went to not to promote Forbes too much, but I literally called every billionaire on the list to see if we could find a partner to buy control of this mortgage, which would have given us control of Rockefeller Center. And I met David Rockefeller, and I met Jerry Spire. I met a guy named Joe Steinberg, and it ended up becoming very important to me. So it was a great start to my career.
So this is the deal that really put Bill Ackman on the map within the investing scene. At the time, the Rockefeller Center, one of the most iconic landmarks in New York City, was in serious trouble. They had a $1.3 billion mortgage they were sitting on, and the owners, who at the time in the 90s were mostly Japanese investors, were walking away as US real estate was cratering and the building was ultimately falling straight for default. Now, most people would be intimidated by a deal this size and really a deal with this much visibility, but one thing about Ackman is he is very risk on, and sometimes that doesn't pay out for him. We won't touch on that in this video, but it's a trait of his that's going to be consistent throughout his career. So ultimately, Ackman deployed the same strategy that he did when he launched Gotham Partners, and he cold called billionaires within the Forbes 400 list. So whether or not they were actually part of the Forbes 400 or he's just giving his flowers to Forbes here, I don't know. But again, he went out, built a coalition, and raised the capital to make the deal happen, and ultimately took control of Rockefeller Center. So while this Rockefeller Center deal put Bill Ackman on the map, ultimately his firm Gotham Partners was very risk on and got caught up in too many illiquid assets and ultimately had to disband in 2003. He quickly founded Pershing Square Capital, his now hedge fund, and started doing his trademark activist deals. So let's jump back into it and hear how his first activist deal actually went.
And the valuation, was that Tim Horton?
Yes, so
By the way, Tim Horton makes the best pod coffee, just for the record.
Okay, that's good to hear, because we're still indirectly a shareholder. So basically, the first activist investment in Pershing Square was Wendy's. Actually, it was an article in Barron's saying how cheap Wendy's stock was, and it owned a company called Tim Hortons. And at the time, we bought 10% of Wendy's for a valuation of about $4.5 billion for the whole company. And they owned 100% of Tim Hortons. That generated about $450 million of operating income. We thought Tim Hortons was worth a lot more than all of Wendy's. And our thesis was split the two. And so we bought a stake, we called the management, they didn't take our call. Sent an email, they didn't respond. So I had a friend who worked at Blackstone, and I said, would Blackstone do a fairness opinion, in effect, of what Wendy's would be worth if they spun off Tim Hortons?
How did you get Blackstone to take you seriously?
Just a friend who worked there, that, wanted to do business. Blackstone had an investment bank at the time. And Steve Schwartzman actually signed off on the fairness opinion for Wendy spinning off Tim Hortons. And we mailed it in, filed it in a 13D, and 6 weeks later they split the company, stock doubled. And that was the beginning of our activist career at Pershing Square.
So like I mentioned, this was really the deal that defined Bill Ackman's entire activist playbook. So it starts out with coffee, but it ends with a multi-billion-dollar deal that he pulls off against pretty big odds. So like he mentioned in the setup, the early 2000s, Wendy's, the fast food chain, owned 100% of Tim Hortons, which is basically the Canadian version of Dunkin' Donuts for those who are my American viewers. So like Ackman mentioned, he saw the opportunity and he invested in Wendy's, buying 10% at a $4.5 billion valuation, and quickly realized that if he spun off Tim Hortons, it would actually increase the overall valuation of the company. Now, this valuation approach is what's called a sum of parts, which essentially means you take different components of a business and you isolate their specific value. So when you have Wendy's and Tim Hortons together, the value is less than actually separating out the businesses and allowing them to go to market on their own. Now, what's a trademark of his investing style is encouraging these management teams to make the changes that he wants. And while firms are a little bit more receptive to it today in many cases, at this point, Ackman still didn't have the pedigree as an activist investor. So he wasn't getting a response, and ultimately his opinion wasn't being considered despite owning 10% of the business. And that's where the granddaddy of all private equity firms, Blackstone, comes in. So Blackstone is widely known as the most prolific and largest private equity firm on the planet, and Ackman just so happened to have a contact there who was willing to do a valuation opinion for him. So basically, the play that Ackman ran here was paying Blackstone to perform a valuation and ultimately lend credibility to his investment thesis and encourage the management at Wendy's to make the change. And getting Steve Schwarzman, the CEO and founder of Blackstone, to sign off on that valuation recommendation is just the icing on the cake. Ultimately, when Wendy saw that, they made the move several weeks later, and Ackman doubled his investment. The Tim Hortons deal became the blueprint for Ackman in his activist investing. Find the mispricing, pressure management, and if they won't listen, then show the market yourself. It was bold, aggressive, and ultimately launched Bill Ackman on a trajectory to become one of the legendary modern activist investors of our time. With that, I'm Boardroom Wire. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave me a like and subscribe. And for more strategic breakdowns on business and technology, come back and check out the channel. See you on the next one.